Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our broadcast today. My name is Connie Menger, and I'm the Regional Consultant for the Eastern Region, working for Elder Abuse Ontario. We're very happy to have you here today to listen to our webinar about when someone moves in and won't move out, all about home takeovers. So once again, welcome. All attendees will be muted during the webinar. It is, however, being recorded and will be accessible to you following the webinar. If you are experiencing issues, please type into the chat or question box and you can send a message to myself, also listed as Mary Mead. During the webinar, there will be some poll questions asked of you. Please respond to the questions in the chat box. These questions will be related to the presentation that Nicole Lee is providing and will be generating some comments and additional issues that you may want to think about. The chat box is located on the toolbar column near the bottom. We will also, of course, allocate some time for questions and answers. At the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to fill out an evaluation form. Please fill out the form, as this is very important for us for your feedback to guide us for future webinars. You will also receive an email link to the evaluation after this session that will help you to go in and complete that. So a little bit about Elder Abuse Ontario. We are an organization that envisions an Ontario where seniors are safe and respected. And we do this through our mission of creating an Ontario that is free from abuse for all seniors through awareness, education, training, collaboration, service coordination, and advocacy. We are the organization that oversees the implementation of the Ontario strategy to combat elder abuse. Part of our work is, of course, community coordination, and that is what we are here doing today. We are continuing to offer webinars on a provincial basis to the elder abuse networks and to community stakeholders to support knowledge sharing opportunities and to help you build capacity to respond and intervene in cases of elder abuse. So today we thank Nicole Lee for providing her
Unmuted.
to further our understanding of home takeovers. A little bit about Nicole Lee. Nicole Lee is the project coordinator for the Ottawa Home Takeovers Initiative, and she has been partnering with organizations across the city to raise awareness about this issue since 2004. As part of the project, Nicole has continued to work closely with the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities in order to address home takeovers of those with disabilities and other vulnerabilities. Previously, Nicole worked with Crime Prevention Ottawa, which is a municipally based crime prevention partnership that aims to create safer communities. Currently, she works at the Southeast Ottawa Community Health Centre in the Social Services Department. And Nicole has a degree in criminology from Wilfrid Laurier University. So I will hand it over to Nicole at this time for this very interesting topic about home takeovers. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, thanks, Connie. Thanks so much, everyone, for welcoming me here today. It's so great that there's so many people from across the province that are interested in this issue. And we have been working on it for quite a few years now. And we have, I think, made some great strides towards really understanding what home takeovers are and addressing them in our city. So I will go over a little bit about our partnerships as I get into a bit about where we started with this project and where we are now. So let's start then with a little bit of a definition of home takeovers, because often people get home takeovers confused with a home invasion. So really a home takeover is a situation where a legitimate tenant finds themselves unsafe physically, financially, or psychologically because of the presence of people in their home that they may or may not be able to remove. So we say may or may not because in a lot of cases, home takeovers happen and the person that is the victim of the home takeover doesn't realize the risks associated with having that person in their house. They may not want that person to leave for a number of reasons, or they may be afraid to kind of engage in any sort of way to get that person to leave. So we have found that they fall into sort of 4 general categories. So we see sort of the drug gang or the gang-associated takeovers. So these are the ones that you're probably going to see in the news most often, where the police might come in, they might break up some activity in an apartment, they might find drugs in an apartment, that sort of thing. We also see takeovers of the formerly homeless, so individuals who are coming from shelters and who are, happily moving into their own place, but who have some connections still at that shelter, who are now feeling isolated because they're no longer eating their meals next to people, or they're no longer, sleeping next to people. So they tend to be very vulnerable and very isolated. And then we have the takeovers of elderly adults, which I think is what many of us are here to learn about today. And we see this sort of across the spectrum. So in some ways, we have some sort of older adults who are isolated, who might meet a charming stranger on the street, who might strike up a conversation with somebody and invite them over to their home. And in a lot of cases, we see it happening with family members as well. So it might be a son or a daughter who's coming back into the family home and might be taking over that person's home. So that might involve, taking their money, bringing in people they don't want there, using substances they don't want there. It can in some cases involve physical violence as well, emotional abuse, mental abuse, all sorts of situations that make people sort of uncomfortable in their own space. And then, of course, we have people who are victim to home takeovers who don't necessarily fall into any of those categories, right? So they could just be sort of an isolated, vulnerable individuals. So we know, as I mentioned, that not all home takeovers look the same. They can involve friends, they can involve acquaintances, they can involve family members. So I did plan to show some videos today. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that, but I will describe some scenarios to you that we have seen. So we'll get a little bit of a sense of what a home takeover can look like. So yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit about how this program started and the partnerships that we've developed as part of this program. So back in 2013, we started hearing at Crime Prevention Ottawa from frontline service providers, so people who worked at the Ottawa Community Housing Corporation, for example, which is our largest social housing provider in the city of Ottawa, people who worked at Youth Services Bureau, people who worked at the Canadian Mental Health Association, basically people who were working with clients on a regular basis who were housed, who were vulnerably housed, and they were saying that there were situations where people were being taken advantage of in their homes by people who didn't break in, but people who were invited to be there. We had no way to sort of talk about what this was. There was no name given to what was going on. And so we decided back in 2013 to do a little bit of research about this. So we first did a literature review. We hired somebody to do a literature review, and they found that there was no information. Nobody had studied this in North America. So the research that she got from the UK, and in the UK they called it cuckooing, which was named after the cuckoo birds who would come into other birds' nests and take over. But that didn't really translate here. People didn't really understand sort of what that concept was. So we did end up changing the name to Home Takeovers, and that seemed to resonate much better with our service providers in the city. So after that report was published, a lot of the service providers came forward and said, you know what, this is great that we're finally looking at this, but I think we need to do some more research, because the research that we were doing was obviously local to the UK, not to Canada, which is, what we really need to know. How is this happening in Ottawa? So later that year, we had that researcher come back, to do a survey of 133 frontline workers and a handful of interviews, just to sort of develop some information around what was going on in the city. And from that was a research report developed called Home Takeovers of Vulnerable Tenants, Perspectives from Ottawa. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you some links that you can go to check out our tools, and you can read that whole research report as well. It's about 28 pages long, so I won't go into too many of those details, but just a few of the things that we found out from that research. So 72% of those surveyed had encountered at least one takeover. 32% said they had experienced 10 or more in their line of work. So we know that this is happening a lot more often than we thought. Unfortunately, we didn't know the extent to which this was happening, so the parameters of our survey were a little bit off. When we asked the question, how many of these have you experienced in your line of work, the choices were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus. So because of that, we weren't really sure if 10 plus meant 11 or if it meant 100. So when we have 32% of those people saying they experienced 10 or more, it means we don't necessarily know the extent to which this is happening in the city. I can tell you that in my work in home takeovers over the last about two and a half years, that I've talked to a lot of service providers who have said, I was dealing with one last week. I suspect that there's one going on right now, but we haven't sort of confirmed that, or I am dealing with one right now. So we know that they are happening a lot. So at least in our city, they're happening primarily in high and low-rise apartment buildings. So high-rise apartment buildings having the highest amount and single homes being the least common. And this could be due to a variety of factors, being that, people who live in single-family homes are generally not sharing the walls with somebody. So you might know a little bit more about what's going on with your neighbor when you're sharing a wall with them. There's also a lot of sort of community development happening in our high-rise buildings in this city, particularly through our social housing providers. So there is a little bit of more of neighbors knowing neighbors, so it reduces the isolation in some sense, but it also means that people are sort of talking about what they're seeing. And because a lot of the single family ones that we're seeing are family members, so this is a lot of the senior ones that we're seeing, save for the ones that are in seniors buildings, but it's perpetrated by family members, and that means that they aren't getting reported as much because there's a lot of sort of fear associated with that. There's a lot of shame associated with that, and a lot of people who are in the situation that we found don't recognize their situation as a home takeover. They just sort of recognize it as, well, I'm inviting my son or my daughter back in, and this is just what they do. It's not really a big deal, or they've sort of accepted that's what's happening. We also know that, at least in our city, they are localized to any area of the city. So we, like many cities, have our urban centers, and then we have sort of our subdivisions and our rural areas, and we're finding them happening everywhere. They just present differently depending on where they are. Generally speaking, those who are victimized by home takeovers have a range of vulnerabilities. So this can be addictions, mental health issues, disabilities, developmental disabilities. Isolation is probably one of the biggest factors. So people who are just feeling alone, and people who are coming from homeless shelters, as I mentioned. And the important thing to note is that there's no single catch-all resolution to home takeovers. So we know how unique and how complex these situations are. We know why there are issues sometimes with people reporting them. We know that there are issues with how we intervene in certain situations compared to other situations. So they're generally resolved using a lot of creative solutions, and through a series of interventions and support from multiple service providers. And they're often very personalized. So after this research came out, we found all these statistics out. We recognized that we really needed to start looking into this situation a little bit more. It wasn't enough to do just the research on it. So we put together a home takeovers steering committee, which consists of a lot of partners within our city. So we have SALIS, which is a mental health agency. We have the Canadian Mental Health Association, Youth Services Bureau, Ottawa Community Housing, as I mentioned, the Ottawa Police, Crime Prevention Ottawa, the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. So we have a lot of partners that sit around that table. Oh, and the shelters as well, who are very important to this. So the Salvation Army is there as well. And since we sort of developed this committee, we decided that there needed to be someone to work specifically on home takeovers, which is where I came in. So our main partners are Crime Prevention Ottawa, who initially started the project and who are now funding the project through the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. And they gave this project to OCAP because OCAP had seen this happen to a number of their clients and actually had 2 clients that they mentioned who had unfortunately died as a result of their home takeover. So they were very close to this, so they took it on. So we'll get a little bit now into how something like this happens. So it can be that a friend is looking for a temporary place to sleep. So we see this happen a lot with our youth situations, for example. So, often ends up very well-meaning. So somebody loses their job, they get evicted from their home, and they need a place to stay for a couple of days. And that can be sort of a very a well-meaning thing. They often come in, they'll leave in a couple of days. But in some situations that we've seen, that friend will stay there and they'll start taking advantage of the person that's living there, whether it is taking their money, taking their food, stealing their cigarettes, all sorts of stuff. Again, making them feel uncomfortable in their home. The other situations that we see are the ones where they offer free drugs, or they kind of feed into somebody's addiction in order to make sure that they are able to stay there. So I'll give you an example of this happening. Somebody that I talked to during this this project, who's been very vocal about his experience with home takeovers, was somebody who was living in a shelter. He did eventually get his own place. He was starting to clean up. He did have an addiction, but he was really proud of the progress that he had made. So when he got his own place, he went back to the shelter to see a few of his buddies who were obviously still there and said, why don't you come over for a hot meal, have a hot shower, and, I can sort of talk to you about, what you can do now, how you can achieve this if you just sort of, get the help. So they came over and they obviously they took him up on his offer for the hot meal, the hot shower, and in return, they gave him some drugs. And he said, no, I don't want that. I don't do that anymore. I don't need that. And eventually they sort of persuaded him, by manipulative tactics, saying things like, oh, it's just for our appreciation. It'll feel good. We know you don't need it, but it'll be nice to just sort of have that. And so he did end up taking the drugs. And unfortunately, he found himself addicted again. Those people ended up moving in. Other people ended up moving in. They started cooking and selling out of his place. And they were keeping him quiet by giving him drugs. So now, again, he is addicted to drugs. So now he's started to run the drugs for them. But he knows he's in a bad situation. But he doesn't know what to do about it because he's afraid that if he calls the police, one, he's going to make some really nasty enemies. Two, I mean, if anybody were to come in, his visitors would just say, oh, those aren't my drugs. I don't live here. They're his drugs. So he was worried that everybody was going to get arrested, including himself, and he would lose his connection to those drugs because he was addicted. So it became a very difficult situation for him, and it was a situation that he was in for the next 10 years. So he was jumping from place to place to place, trying to escape these people, but not really being able to. So we also have situations where the person who is in the situation is looking for companionship or protection. So whether it is just an isolated individual looking for companionship, or a single mother who is trying to get out of a bad relationship, who ends up inviting somebody in for protection and ends up in a similar situation. And then we have the family members who are looking for support from their parents, for their grandparents, from their siblings, etc. Similarly to the friend, is often very well-meaning, but can end up in a situation where that person is now, taking their money, taking their food, all of those things that I mentioned before. We have heard of situations, particularly in our older adult cases, where the older adult has been locked in the basement while the family has taken over the upstairs. So we do see physical abuse happening in these situations as well. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about prevention, so how we can keep things like this from happening to the clients that we serve. So the first thing that I say is to make sure that there are positive relationships at play. So making sure that you as service providers or in your line of work have positive relationships with your partners. So police, landlords specifically, and the tenants or the clients that you're serving are crucial to successful prevention, intervention, and aftercare. And we'll go over that a little bit more. But because home takeovers are so complex, solutions often involve the participation and cooperation of multiple players. Often people have different pieces of the puzzle, right? So a landlord might know something significantly different about what's going on in a unit. Maybe they've heard about the noise complaints, the constant partying or something that's going on in a unit. Well, that person's worker might know something a little bit different, right? So that person's worker might know that there has been somebody staying in the home for an extended period of time, but they might be saying, oh, there's nothing wrong, I don't mind this person being there. But meanwhile, there's other things going on that not everybody knows about. The other thing is to talk to the client or talk to the individual about what they want for their space. So we often tell housing providers, people who have clients who are moving into places, to talk about what they want with their space. So are there potential people in that person's life that can put them at risk? And, sometimes it is family members, and that's always a tough conversation to have. But say somebody has a son who has addictions issues, right, and has a hard time maintaining employment or housing and is constantly asking for that individual's assistance. Just encouraging your client or the person who is now moving into housing to ask some questions of that person before they allow the visitor in, right? So does the visitor do this often? How does that normally end for that client or that individual who's moving into a house? What are the expectations for that space? So should it be a drug-free space? Will having the visit over jeopardize that? Does that person have friends or other associates that they might not want there? So just encouraging them to ask some key questions. The other thing is just having a conversation with that person about what a home takeover is, right? Because education is key to prevention. So talk to them about what the potential consequences are, right? So it can be, mental abuse. It can be losing housing. It can be losing money. It can be physical abuse, and those sort of safety issues as well. And then reducing isolation. So as I said, the biggest factor towards home takeovers is isolation. So everybody that we have seen that has undergone or fallen victim to a home takeover has been in some way isolated. So community building in this sense is really important, right? Because when people are connected to each other, they're much more likely to notice when something is wrong and be willing to address it, which is why yes, home takeovers do happen a lot in our high-rise apartments, but it also means that we're hearing about them a little bit more because there are people sort of keeping an eye out and watching what's going on in their neighborhood. So at this point, I just want you to sort of put your thinking hats on. We were going to show videos. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So I'm going to describe a scenario to you, and it is based off of one of these videos. At the end of my presentation, there are links to where you can find these videos. Because we're unable to show the videos, our webinar will be a little bit shorter, I think, than we initially planned, but I encourage you to take that extra time, maybe to watch a couple of these videos. We do have 8 videos, so we have one video that is specifically guided towards service providers, and that's sort of a prevention piece. And then we have 7 videos that are around different scenarios of home takeovers. So we have sort of a general isolation one, we have a youth, we have addictions, we have gangs, we have developmental disabilities, and then we have 2 on older adults. One of them is a friend scenario, so where you would meet somebody on the street or an acquaintance and invite that person in. And then one is a family scenario, and that's the one that I'm going to share with you today. And just as sort of a side note, when you do watch these videos, and I hope you do, is that these were all filmed with the help of volunteers. So every actor that you see in this video is a volunteer, and a lot of them have had this situation happen to them before. So, and have been very open and vocal about wanting to share their experience, just to sort of help the program along in the city. So it was voluntary, and I think that makes it a little bit more realistic. When you do watch the videos, I also want you to keep in mind that these are all situations that are coming with solutions. And one thing that we need to keep in mind when we're dealing with these situations is that they are not all this quick and easy to handle, right? They are complex, they are unique, and it will involve some sort of creative solutions in order to address them. And all of the situations that you will see in these videos are based on scenarios that have happened, that have been told to us by people who have experienced a home takeover. So I just want to get you thinking, and I will be asking you a question afterwards. So I want you to sort of put your thinking hats on. So imagine a situation where a son has lost his job and he is approaching his mother, who is a senior, to stay. And she, of course, wants to help her son out as much as possible. So she gladly accepts that. Now, in the next scene of the video, you know, he's looking a little bit down. But in the next scene of the video, we see her lounging there. She's watching TV. And he just walks in. He takes the remote. He changes the channel. He plops down next to her and says, "Hey, Mom, what's for dinner?" She's looking a little bit taken aback, you know, like she's supposed to make him dinner. She mentions that she's going to go get something. But he says, "No, don't worry about it, Mom. You know, I wanted to get out. Let me go. Where's your bank card? Can I have your PIN number?" She doesn't think much of this because it's her son, and, you know, she's willing to share that information with him. So she gives it to him. He leaves. He comes back with groceries and a case of beer. And he gives her card back, and he says, "Mom, you're running out of money." And she's a little confused because she has just deposited a check last week, and she's not quite sure where that money has gone. So as they're having this conversation, the doorbell rings, and she moves to get it, and her son says, pardon me, her son says, "No, don't worry about it. Let me get the door. You just take care of the groceries." So she says, all right. She starts taking care of the groceries, and he goes to the door. He answers the door, and it is one of her friends. And he opens the door just a crack, and she's looking a little concerned, and she says, "Hi, is Marilyn here?" You'll see in the video. Is Marilyn here? Marilyn is his mother's name. And he says, "Oh, my mom? No, she's busy right now. She can't come to the door." And she says, "Oh, okay, well, can you just let her know that I stopped by?" And he says, yeah, I'll let her know. And he slams the door in her face. So it appears that this woman has not talked to Marilyn for quite some time. Is a little bit concerned about, you know, where she's been. I'm sorry, I just have to take a bit of a drink. So in the next scene, we see that the house is starting to get a little bit messy. His stuff is everywhere. He's now lounging totally comfortably on the couch, watching a movie, watching TV. And his mom is reading the paper. And his mom says, hey, there's a job fair at the community center. Maybe you should go check it out. And he just cuts her off. He says, Mom, you're nagging me. Why are you nagging me? You know that's a waste of my time. And she says, I just want you to be happy. I want you to be able to get out and meet some people. And he kind of softens up a bit. But then he sort of delves into a conversation about, how he wants to take care of her. He knows that her health hasn't been particularly good lately. And if her health were to fail, and, God forbid he doesn't want that to happen, but if it were to happen, who's going to take care of her affairs for her? So he starts talking about this power of attorney conversation. And she's feeling a little bit of pressure on this, right? So she's starting to feel like, oh, he's pushing it a little bit too much, but she doesn't want to say too much because it is her son. So she says, I've started to think about it, but I'm not really sure. And he continues sort of that pressure on her, saying, haven't I always been a good son? I'm always looking out for your safety. Don't you think I'm in the best position to take care of your affairs for you in case something happens? And the scene basically ends with her saying, you know what, let me make a decision later, and him just getting frustrated and saying, fine, whatever. And in sort of the last part of that video, we see her calling a friend, the friend who showed up at the door. And her friend says to her, oh my gosh, I haven't heard from you for so long. I've been worried. I've left messages. Your son tells me you're never home. And she basically says, I'm always home, and my son hasn't given me any of the messages that you've left me. So she's starting to recognize that she needs a little bit of support. So that is the second video associated with a family member that I want you to think about, and it can be very similar to some of the situations that you've seen before. We have heard of situations through our sort of elder abuse response network amongst in the city that the power of attorney talk, that sort of manipulation is something that does come up quite a bit. And that in some situations we have individuals who are handing over the lease to their house or the ownership to their house, saying that, oh, you know what, I was going to do it in my will anyway, and then handing it over early. And of course at that point they don't really have any stake as to what goes on in that space because it's no longer their own space. So so we have seen a lot of situations like this, and that sort of manipulative behavior is something that we see a lot in this population. So I'm going to now ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to pop them up on the screen, and as Connie mentioned at the beginning, please write your responses in the chat box below. So thinking about, what has happened in that situation that I just mentioned, what are some of the things that you might notice to alert you to the problem? So there might be some red flags, some things that might be a little bit off, understanding that for the majority of the time, you are not going to be granted access into that home, right? So it'll be sort of from the outside. So what might you see from the outside that would alert you to the problem? So feel free to write your responses in the chat box. I will go over some of the answers, or quote-unquote answers, some of the solutions that we have come up with.
We do have a question about the video links being put into an email. They will be in the presentation on the last one of the last slides, so you can look forward to seeing them there.
All right, so I don't think anybody has come in with a response for me yet. So I just want to go over a couple of little things then. So a tip is to pay attention to behavior and also to environment. So when we talk about behavior in terms of this woman, for example, her friend might notice that she's no longer talking to that person. she might notice that that person is becoming a little bit more withdrawn, that she's no longer seeing friends or family members. We know that, oh, sorry, we're just kind of working this out here. We have some, yeah. We are working out. We are not sure if we're able to see your chats right now. I see that a few of you do have your hands
Somebody has
raised.
a hand.
Somebody has a
I see some answers here. So some people have noted some warning signs here.
Oh, so
I guess I just put it in the question box. So one person responded, the individual is more withdrawn or socially isolated.
perfect, yeah.
Another person mentioned, may notice Marilyn is not attending appointments. Another red flag is if the individual is falling behind on finances, substance misuse.
Yeah.
They talk about the attempts to isolate her,
Yeah.
she's not participating in usual activities, and if her friends notice that there is a change to her availability or her usual habits.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You see them now. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they're popping up now. So I'm certainly looking at some of these things and seeing, yes, for sure. So does not have groceries, for example. So that's certainly something where we see somebody who might be looking a little bit weaker, who might not have the access to food that she used to, who might now be approaching other people to say, you know, I'm having a hard time paying my bills, or I'm having a hard time buying groceries. And that's really, really unusual for her. She's somebody that manages her money quite well. So yeah, so I've gotten some of the sort of usual habits, differences in the behavior that she's exhibiting. Hearing about a new person in her life, certainly, or knowing that there is a person in her life who is now staying with her. So, you know, most people don't bat an eyelash when somebody says, my son is coming to stay with me. But then you start to notice some differences, some changes that you have all identified, that you can't, that she has isolated herself, that she's changed her social activities, that her life seems to have increased in stress, that she is postponing regular appointments, that she's stopped responding to requests. So, you know, whether you know, you've been calling her, she hasn't been responding, or she's no longer answering the door, or if you had a regular meeting with her, say once a week, you went out to coffee or something, and all of a sudden, you know, she's no longer keeping those appointments. And of course, those sort of physical changes to herself as well, right? So, you know, she's, as I said, looking a little weak, looking a little uncomfortable. Maybe she looks like she hasn't done laundry in a while, because this is all sort of indications of stress. Maybe she's lost weight. Are there signs of physical abuse? You know, does she have bruises? All things to keep an eye on. And then, of course, we see the physical environment problems as well. So say this woman lives in a seniors building, or in a high-rise or low-rise apartment building, in a townhome, anywhere like that, and her neighbors are making noise complaints. All of a sudden, you know, she's up a lot later. She's playing music later. She is having some people over at, you know, 1 or 2 in the morning that certainly didn't used to be there. There are different people coming to the house than we've seen coming to the house before. So, you know, maybe some younger people, maybe her son's friends, certainly not her friends. So that sort of increase in traffic as well can certainly be an indication that something is going on. But also, just to keep an eye on increased traffic, especially at strange hours. We often see that associated with drug dealing, and the ones that do have some drug affiliations going on. And of course, if you see the same guest coming in and out. So we know that as I said, you know, having a son there isn't usually a big deal. Unless, of course, you are noticing all of these physical changes, these environmental changes, these behavioral changes that are all kind of going together. And it's a good idea to pay attention to what's going on. It might not necessarily be a home takeover, but it is certainly an indication that there is something sort of going on with that person in their home. Of course, if you get access to that environment, you know, there would be things there that don't necessarily belong there. Might be looking a little messier. There might be some drug paraphernalia sticking around, some beer bottles that, you know, she's not really a beer drinker. What is that doing here? There's clearly belongings in that home that aren't for her. You might see, as one of you mentioned, that there's no food in the home, right? So just sort of taking stock of the environment. So there was a case I can mention that somebody had brought to my attention, somebody who worked in sort of the elder abuse field here in Ottawa, and she told me about a case. She called me up one day about a case of a man who lived in a building. It's either a man or a couple who lived in a building. Was somebody who, you know, always paid his rent on time, was very quiet, kept to himself, but was overall a good tenant. They then noticed that he had 2 house guests that didn't necessarily look like people who were his friends. Younger people, maybe family members, you know, a little bit unclear as to who they were. But then he started showing up in the hallways, looking a little bit out of sorts. He would be leaning against the walls. He stopped paying his rent on time. You know, neighbors started to complain that there was some noise coming out of there. And then they found him urinating in an elevator one day. So it was very clear that his behavior had very much changed when these people had arrived, and they suspected that there was a home takeover going on, that there was some drug abuse happening, and that he was now, you know, involved in sort of their drug issues. So, so again, things to keep an eye out for when somebody might be going through a home takeover. So I didn't skip the slide, but it is there, some of the stuff that I've talked about, and that's just a few of the things that we're seeing. And just a note that one of the tools that we'll have a link for at the end of the presentation is something called the Home Takeovers Guidebook. And the Home Takeovers Guidebook is something that we wrote in 2015 with the help of our Home Takeovers Committee and the service providers that we talked to who have been dealing with this issue. But basically to highlight things that have worked for us in terms of red flags, prevention, intervention, and aftercare. So it is not, it's not a one-stop shop for everything that you could possibly do to manage a home takeover. Again, as I mentioned, solutions are often unique, very personalized, very creative, but there are things that have worked for us. So you will get a link to that as well at the end of the presentation. So I want to ask another question now, moving on now that we've discussed a little bit about the red flags. Some of you might have dealt with these situations before, so I want to get an idea of what are some of the things that you might consider doing to intervene in this situation. Again, please, we can now see your comments, so we'll respond as they come up, but some of the things that you might be doing to intervene in this situation. And some of you have probably already done some of these things. So either in the situation that I mentioned or in the situations that you have dealt with. So some of the things that you might do to intervene. We have a couple of people that are handing up. Absolutely. Okay, so a lot of you are saying, of course, speaking to the client about their rights, telling your client how to get out of the environment and explaining the options and consequences to the client. Obviously, putting safety planning into place. So you have mentioned changing the locks, discussing getting a new key fob, deactivating the entry fob. Again, it's a lot about talking to them. And I like what some of you said, being a friend to the client. So making sure that they feel open enough to talk to you about these situations, right? Because the thing that you don't want is to come off too pushy and too much like you're trying to solve their problems for them. And we find that in a lot of these cases that we see, it's often about little prods, right? Little pokes to try and get out of the situation, as many of you mentioned, explaining their rights, explaining what the consequences can be, explaining what a home takeover is and what's happening in that situation. But to be wary of pushing too hard, because in a lot of cases, obviously this woman in this case, she loves her son, right? So she doesn't want to immediately call the police and get him kicked out because she's worried about what's going to happen to him. He obviously doesn't have a job. He might have some alcoholism issues. She doesn't want him to be on the streets, right? So yes, being a little bit conscious about that. Decreasing isolation, definitely. So making sure that this person feels as though they have a network in which they can get the support. Working with partners, so police and support services, to talk about a safety plan is certainly necessary and is certainly a good thing to do. What I like from your responses, from what I'm seeing from you guys, is to talk to the residents about, or the resident, whoever's going through it, the victim, to implement a plan of action. So what did they want to happen? So what did they want for their space? And specifically, what do they want to see happen to the person who is currently in their space? As I mentioned, often close personal relationships. So to sort of walk in there and say, this is what you should be doing, they'll often back away and say, I don't want to do that because I don't want anything bad to happen to this person who's in my home. Contacting other family members, certainly if there are other people around or other people that are close to this individual, whether friends or family members, is always a good option to say, maybe that person would be better equipped to talk about or to talk to the client about what's going on in their space. Offering possible steps to have the son removed to their home. I'm not going to go through all of these. You guys have some really, really, really great suggestions. And yes, I mean, somebody has said caution recommending the police right away is certainly true. Again, it is about working with that person to see. Sometimes they do want police intervention. Sometimes they really, really don't. So we have been, and I just want to put out there that we have been working with the police to be sort of very sensitive about these situations. They are a very large partner of ours, at least in Ottawa, about how to deal with these situations in a manner that kind of treats the person who is calling in as a victim, even if it is sort of associated with drugs or gangs. So, so sometimes it is about figuring out what kind of supports that you can offer to the perpetrator, because if we don't want anything bad to happen to him, we have to figure out something to do, right? We have to figure out some way to help him, and in that case, we'll also help her. As I said, it's about gentle encouragements. So knowing that you provide a place where you have non-judgmental support and assistance. If it's a situation where you suspect that there is some criminal activity, some drug dealing, anything like that, working with the landlord has proven really successful for us. So maybe it's about doing door knocks, flyer drops, doing who to call information, visiting more frequently, at unscheduled times, responding to false noise complaints, which has worked. Discuss increasing sort of a security presence around them, just making the person who is in that unit aware that something is up, that you are sort of on to what's going on. And in some cases, maybe not necessarily with family members, not always with family members, but certainly with some of the gang and drug associated ones that we've seen, putting heat on the apartment is been a successful way to get those people to leave, because once they realize that somebody is onto them, they know what's going on, they'll usually leave. The problem that we're facing is that usually they'll leave, but they'll go somewhere else. So really, we're trying to make some sort of effort to not just shift the problem, but to really solve the problem. And many of you, of course, have mentioned identifying and engaging potential partners, so people who have different pieces of the puzzle, whether it is friends, family members, other social service providers, police, people who might have different pieces. Okay, and of course, when it is, a crime of progress, you all know, call 911, right? So here are some of the things that have worked for us in the past. Some people like to go straight to their community police officer because they find them a little bit more approachable. But you can, at least in Ottawa, I know we call into the general reporting line. We have worked very closely with them to talk about calling in specifically for home takeovers, because I think, as many of you know, home takeovers themselves aren't a crime type. So there's a lot of things around home takeovers that are illegal. You have the drug dealing, we have the physical abuse, we have the forcible confinement in a lot of these situations. But home takeovers themselves are not a crime type. So when we call into the Ottawa Police, we have been working with them very closely on this, and also working to really explain to, it's a big police service, to explain to them what a home takeover looks like. Because the problem that I know a lot of people that we talked to when they were calling into the police is they would call, they would say, I have somebody in my house that won't get out, and the police will say, well, do you want us to come and kick them out? And they're like, well, I'm not sure, I invited this person in. And then the police say, well, that's not our problem then if you invited the person in. So we're really working with the police to sort of identify what a home takeover really looks like, and know that inviting the person in is a major component of what a home takeover is. So the last question I want to put out to you is, say you're able to resolve the home takeover. So resolve it in the sense that this person is now gone, but there obviously might be, if it is a family member, this person might come back. What are some of the things that you can support the victim following the resolution, and try to ensure or encourage them from allowing somebody back in, and encourage it and decrease the likelihood of a home takeover happening again? Frequent check-ins definitely is the first on my list. And a couple of you have already mentioned that, and decreasing isolation. So yes, inviting to social events, finding something that person is interested in, right? So one of the things that we say is really learn about your client and really learn about what their interests are. What are some of the things that you could do to suggest, even if it's volunteer options or people they could meet, groups they could join? So yes, increasing supports, as some of you have mentioned. Creating an aftercare plan. So certainly creating a safety plan. So whether it is, if it was in a situation where they have concerns, as some of you have mentioned, changing the locks, or talk about finding a new place to live, that sort of safety planning, talking to them about, well, when is a good time for me to intervene? If you make a guest policy, say, I will only allow somebody to stay in my house for one night before they have to leave. Talk about, okay, so how do we implement this guest policy? How can we get involved? How can I support you? How can I help you to ensure that you stick to that guest policy? The other thing is making sure that you are reestablishing a positive environment, because in a lot of these cases, particularly with cases that do involve family members, you're not only dealing with the after effects of a home takeover, so there's trauma associated with that, whether there was the physical abuse, the mental abuse, the emotional abuse happening there, but you might also be dealing with the breakdown of a relationship that was very important to that person. So, in this case, you're dealing with the home takeover, but you're also dealing with a relationship that this woman now has with her son that could be really not good for her, right? So you have to be sensitive to the fact that, yes, we don't want a home takeover to happen to this person again, but we also want to help this woman recover after she's had this big falling out with her son, or potentially had this big falling out with her son, right? So you know, as you've all said, reducing isolation, helping her volunteer, meet new people, connecting her to supports and services, and sometimes, similar as to some of you mentioned in the intervention, is to be a friend, right? Just to be there as emotional support for that person. Sometimes it's about helping them clean up their place after the guest leaves. Maybe it's something that you can encourage them to help make their space their own, right? So, you know, whether it's painting a wall, doing an art project, adopting a pet, making their space their own so that they love it. Because often people who love their space are less likely to let people come in and take it over. So sort of just making that space comfortable for them, making it a positive environment for them. So I think you guys have been really, really good at responding to these questions. Most of you have said keep visiting. Frequent check-ins is the most important thing. Helping them figure out how to serve the best interests of their adult child or whoever has taken over their space. Creating an aftercare plan, decreasing isolation. You guys have really got it all. So my sense is that you guys have really worked on these situations before. And again, for, you know, aftercare mechanisms, continue educating them, right? They obviously at this point will know what a home takeover is, but it might be about now resiliency training, teaching them how to say no if somebody is coming to ask them for their assistance or for their home as a place to stay, and telling them that, you know, sometimes it's better to be able to offer supports rather than, you know, give your home up to support that person. It's always better to help support in that sense, right? So teaching them, you know, ways to take away the welcoming mat, right? Just to say no. And then cycle into some of the preventative methods that we have talked about before. And importantly, figuring out a way to help the perpetrator. Now, this isn't always going to be the case, especially when we're talking about gangs or those very highly drug-associated ones. That might not be feasible, but certainly in a relationship such as this, figuring out ways to help the perpetrator as well. All right, so sorry if I repeated myself a little bit there. I was trying to both read the answers to the questions that I was telling you and then go through things myself, so it was sorry if I did any sort of repeating. All right. So again, this is some of the things that we talked about, very briefly some of the things that we talked about, and you will get copies of this slideshow so that you can look over what we've talked about here. All right, now I think that
so if there are any questions, Nicole has finished her presentation, and we are open to receiving your comments and your questions at this time. So please take a moment and let us know.
And again, so you will be given, I think, a link to this slideshow. You will be sent the slides. How can you order the videos? So the videos, we don't give away hard copies of the videos. They are all available on YouTube. So at the end, we will have links to all of the videos that you can find on YouTube. Unfortunately, they aren't downloadable via YouTube, but they are available on the internet. Now, that said, if we do get enough demand, and this is something that we have talked about before, about doing hard copies of the videos, my contact information will be up. You will have it as part of this PowerPoint presentation, and you can always email me to say, but, you know, I'd really like hard copies of these videos to start showing to people who I do presentations for, and that's fine.
Okay, not seeing any more questions.
Not seeing too many questions here. And if there are some things that you think about or specific situations, and I want to remind you, I don't do casework specifically, but I have, you know, I have a lot of connections in Ottawa to talk to them about certain situations. If there is a situation that you want to talk about, again, my contact information will be there. If you think of any questions or have any concerns or anything like that, you can always feel free email me. So I am finding a couple of questions. So in terms of working with banks more closely to monitor, so I know that in some situations that banks and lawyers and accountants have sort of become involved in the circle of care for that person and have become people to talk to. It is a bit of a challenge. Because obviously as a service provider we aren't really told if there is something different going on with this person's bank account. So we do know that once we kind of identify that something is going on, that in some cases we have approached banks to talk about sort of account activity. In keeping in mind, of course, privacy has always been one of the biggest issues that we faced here in terms of sharing client information. So we have figured out some workarounds around that, but yeah, so we have worked with banks in the past. Are the videos captioned? Yes, they are. We also have them in French for people who are looking for them in French. They are captioned in French. So we have captioned versions. I think I'll have to look into it. I don't remember how we did this, but I think that we have captioned them through YouTube and put in our own captioning, because if anybody has ever used the closed captioning on YouTube, it is absolutely terrible. But I believe we put in our own closed captioning on it. And again, they're in French captioned as well. We do have pamphlets. So part of the tools that we have large posters. So we have large posters that people have put up in their buildings. So they currently exist in some of our Ottawa community housing buildings. And we also have little handout cards, and little handout cards that basically just say, what is a home takeover, how they hook you, how can we address home takeovers, what can you do? And those are generally designed for residents. So we have handed those out in the thousands, delivered them under doors. When I say flyer drops, in terms of resolving these situations, a lot of them have come by dropping home takeover pamphlets. So I, again, will give you the link to that, but you can also order them in larger quantities through Crime Prevention Ottawa. So what I would suggest is, if you want pamphlets, you can take a look at what they look like online. They actually, if I can go back, sorry, you will get my contact information. I'm wondering if I can go back a couple to where the videos were. I'll show you what they look like. And you can email me. You can tell me how many you want to order, and we can get you a bunch ordered. So we're almost there. I'll just show you. All right, so this is the guidebook, the printed copy of the guidebook. It's moving on its own. So, oh my goodness. Hang on. On forward. All right, so this is the poster. So this is on large scale, sort of tabloid paper, maybe a little bit larger. And then there's a lot more information on those little cards. I don't have a photo of it in this slideshow, but there's little cards as well. Okay, I'm just reading one of your comments now, so I'll just read it out. The son has lived with his mother for many years. He's never worked or helped his mom out or participated. She needs help in the home, but he does not provide the help. She wants to move to a retirement home to get the help, but she doesn't want her son to leave. And he hasn't responded to his mom needing more care. Does this make it a takeover? I would say that this is a very common situation. And yes, I mean, if she has expressed that she wants her son out, he's an adult who, could be earning. I mean, I think we'd have to talk about if there's capacity issues on the son's side as well. But certainly, I mean, it's very similar to the situation where somebody comes back into the home and ends up taking over. I think what we really need to think about is whether she's feeling uncomfortable. So whether she's feeling threatened in her own space, whether she wants him out, and it seems like she does. So, yeah, I mean, I would consider that a takeover, again, because she has expressed a desire to have him leave and he won't. Could we receive the flyer in editable format so you could add your own police contacts? So for that, I'm going to have you email me directly. I'm going to send that email to Crime Prevention Ottawa, who we are more than happy to share our resources. We have shared them with a few other places, including Toronto, so with adaptation. So normally what we say when we share our resources is totally fine, put your own information on it, but just say, have our logos on it as adapted from and credit us with the work. But we're totally okay with people using our products. So you'll have to email me directly, and I will be able to set you up with Crime Prevention Ottawa to give you formats that you can use and edit.
It's Rayanne. I have a question. If a child's living with the parent, and are they considered, like, they've kind of moved in and they have their stuff there, are they then considered a tenant? So if you want them to be removed, does the child have any rights?
They're only a tenant if they're on the lease. So
if they're not paying rent or anything like that.
Exactly. They're not paying rent, they're not on the lease, then they aren't actually considered a tenant. So at that point, if the person who is a legitimate tenant wants that person out, then it does become sort of a home takeover situation, right? If that person, I mean, we see a lot of situations where the son or the daughter or the family member or whoever has moved in and they're now sort of this a home with a more extended family in it. That's totally okay if that's okay with the person that's there. But as I mentioned, in a lot of cases, people aren't recognizing that it's a problem. So I think it's really sort of up to caseworkers and service providers to really see if there's any changes going on with the arrival of that person in the home, to see whether or not that person is a sort of a threat to that person being there.
And if they want them to leave and they won't leave, then...
Yeah, and then that's when we start getting into those sort of intervention methods.
Right, okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions?
Well, while you were thinking, I'll just send out here that this is my my contact information here. I would suggest, that's a cell phone number that I do not use very often. I would suggest if you want to contact me via email. I'm much more likely to respond in a quicker time frame there. There is a link there, crimepreventionottawa.ca. So because they were the initial funder of this, all of our home takeover stuff lives under their website. So you can go there. Links to all of the tools are there, as well as their contact information if you have any more sort of questions about the tools, if you wanted hard copies of the tools. The guidebook we've gotten some good feedback about the guidebook from service providers who have used it. So, if you want to order those in hard copy, a lot of it does have, information for Ottawa specifically. But that said, I mean, the prevention, the identification, the intervention methods are going to be sort of universally applicable. Change Ottawa Police Service to, whatever police service you are using in your jurisdiction, and that should be fine. And the videos are available on YouTube, as I mentioned, under Crime Prevention Ottawa's YouTube page. So there's a link down there for you. As I said, there are 8 videos. There are also the French videos as well. So feel free to view those at your own leisure. They take about, I would say there's about 65 minutes worth of video in total. So you have some good viewing material.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
That was very, very interesting. So if there are no more questions, we will finish the webinar for today. Just a reminder that EAO has many resources as well that you can access. And you can certainly visit our website and stay connected with us through Facebook as well. So thank you once again for attending today and taking the time to learn about this important topic. All of you out there across the province, and a special thank you to Nicole for bringing us this information and letting us know about the resources. I was fascinated with the topic, and it's something that we need to be aware of and be able to help people with. So thanks once again, Nicole.
Thank you.
And I guess that will conclude our webinar, and we will see you next time.